Tea, statistics, and mystery authors. Hold on to your teacups, stat nerds, because recently I steeped myself into chapter 13 of The Lady Tasting Tea. And guys, it's like diving into the MCU of statistics. Let's get into it. Picture this: the late 1700s. The founding fathers are squabbling over the authorship of the Federalist Papers. Could you imagine if Twitter was around then? So, the Federalist Papers, 85 articles and 12 without authors. Was it Madison, Hamilton, or maybe it was the Tea Lady? In comes Monsteller and Wallace with their statistical weaponry. They didn't just count words, they counted types of words. Imagine discovering your friend's secret journal style based on how many times they use like and totally and oh my god. They weren't just on a word hunt, they went deeper, like Inception, but for word types. It's about the style, the flair, not just word counts, but how and when they used them. Think of it as like the fingerprint of the writer's soul. Madison used a pun 0.23 times in 1,000 words. Hamilton 3.24 times. And guess what? 11 of the disputed papers didn't use a pun at all. But hold on to your mugs, because here comes the twist. The Bayesian hierarchical model, that's a mouthful for me, is like the inception of stats. Parameters within hyperparameters within, well, you get it. Layers upon layers of data, like the plot twist to your favorite TV drama. But it's not all detective games here. The Bayesian hierarchical model gets its spotlight. Parameters upon hyperparameters. It's like those Russian nesting dolls, but for data. And those aren't your everyday parameters. Nope. They account for variability in the use of these non-content words between different essays. So just when you thought Hamilton and Madison were predictable, the Bayesian model says, hold my quill. Now, for those in the back, this model is all about levels of uncertainty. Remember when you couldn't decide if pineapple belonged on pizza? Okay, well, it's a little deeper than that. And these aren't just regular data dolls. We've got variability in non-content words because between essays. The Bayesian model, it's the sassy aunt who knows all the family secrets. So now let's fast forward to the 1980s. From feathered hair to, I don't know, neon everything. The 3 Mile Island disaster. The reactor operators were like those friends who never believe your gossip because they hear too many false rumors. A warning light? Probably fake news. The reactor operators didn't foresee a meltdown. Guess they were a bit chilled from the previous false alarms? Bayesian decision theory says the reactor operators misjudged the probability of a meltdown because of too many false alarms in the past. Kinda like when you ignore your alarm clock after hitting snooze too many times. Personally, I set like 7 alarms. So by the seventh alarm, when I really need to wake up, in my head, I think, it's probably just the fourth alarm or fifth alarm. I probably have 2 more. Next thing you know, it's like 9 a.m. and I'm late for work. But back to our Federalist mystery. Madison's odds? Probably stronger than your morning espresso. Or I guess in this case, maybe I should have said tea. The Bayesian methods put the probability of Madison being the author at a whopping 90%. I mean, those odds they're better than me actually attending my 8 a.m. classes. So what's clear from this chapter? I'd say stats is not just nerdy number crunching. It's like the unsung hero from Sherlock Holmes of academia, unraveling mysteries one statistic at a time. From tea tasting challenges to historical whodunits, statistics kind of keep things spicy. And well, that's my whirlwind tour of chapter 13. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that I should probably start using the word upon more in my essays. So here's to all the unsung statistics out there. Keep brewing the numbers, keep steeping in the data. Until the next chapter, keep sipping that knowledge tea.
Chapter 14 The Mozart of Mathematics. Andrei Kolmogorov. Born in 1903, when his mother died in childbirth and his mother's boyfriend had abandoned him early, Kolmogorov was raised by his mother's maiden sisters, with his aunt becoming his surrogate mother. Even from an early age, he showed a mathematical prowess, making his first mathematical discovery at the age of 5, that the first k odd numbers were equal to the square of k. When school wasn't challenging enough, he learned higher math from an encyclopedia and even managed to frustrate a physics teacher with his creative plans of perpetual motion machines. In secondary school, when telling his teachers that he wanted to take the final examinations a year early, he was given the certificate without even having to partake in the exams themselves. Even in university, Kolmogorov was a genius and an undergraduate at Moscow State University. He worked part-time as a teacher at a secondary school. But not only did he continue to show his prowess in mathematics, he also participated in a number of extracurricular activities. Even when he did graduate from mathematics, and with Moscow with the required courses, each student was given the choice of taking the final exam or preparing a paper for each of the courses themselves. He never even took a single one of the exams for each of the departments. Instead, he chose to write an original paper, 14 in total, for each and every one. Funny enough, one of the results that he had turned in was actually false, but he only realized it much later in life. Although he disappeared during World War II when the Iron Curtains were installed throughout Germany and the Soviet Union, he still managed to publish a paper at the beginning, which was built off of by a man named Weiner, and used as a top-secret work for America's Cold War. As soon as possible after the Iron Ring was lifted off, after Stalin died in World War II, he began to participate in international meetings and became well known around the world. He was known to be vibrant, friendly, and eager, and he enjoyed teaching and organizing classes for a school in Moscow dedicated to gifted children, even being known to have taken them out on hikes or introduced them to new music or literature. In 1942, he married his wife named Anna, but this did not stop him from pursuing statistics any further. He himself had solved two pressing theoretical problems in statistical history, one being what are true mathematical foundations of probability, and the other being what can be done with data collected over time. When viewing the first question, he decided to think about nature of probability calculations and realized that the probability of an event was exactly like finding the area of an irregular shape. With this, he identified a small set of axioms upon which he could construct the entire body of a probability theory, which became known to be called as the atomization of probability theory, which is still taught today, and is actually one of the only ways that we have been taught to view probability. After that, he began attacking the second problem, to make a statistical calculation possible beforehand. Beforehand, people had assumed that all data was independent, such as if you rolled a dice multiple times, the dice couldn't remember the configuration of the number before it, and therefore the next roll would be completely independent of any of the rules before it. However, most of the modern and real-life techniques with data is actually not independent of one another. An example of that would be like the weights of newborn for each week. If a child gains an unusual amount of weight one week, then the next weeks will reflect that. Or if the child got sick and failed to gain weight on 1 week, the next week's weight will reflect that. Previous statisticians began to attack the problem by creating complicated parameters to account for the fact that over time it would not be independent, and found themselves struggling to proceed much further. Kolmogorov was one of the only that didn't stop there, and he gave a name to the sequence of numbers called the stochastic processes, and he laid the foundations for further work. With his ideas, it became possible to examine records over time and come to highly specific conclusions. Engineering journals today are still filled with methods that have evolved out of his work of the stochastic processes. During the end of his life, he decided to attack one more problem that was both philosophical and mathematical, but he died before he could put and finish his work. It remains unsolved to this modern day. The question was, what does the probability mean in real life? Kolmogorov had produced a mathematical theory of probability, and now he was trying to apply the theorems to real-life problems. The problem is that the interpretation of the mathematical conclusion, the statistical analysis, depends on how you identify these axioms with probability theory in real life. We have to identify the space events, or the spacing between the events, and it has to be specific enough to allow us to calculate the probability measurements of that space. If we can't identify his abstract space, or the abstract space that Kolmogorov was using, the probability statements that emerge from his work could have completely different meanings than what was actually intended. Andrei Kolmogorov died pouring out his original ideas in his last days, with nobody being able to figure out the works that he still has left in process.
This is chapter 18 of The Lady Tasting Tea, Does Smoking Cause Cancer? To set up this chapter, we looked at the work of R.A. Fisher and Joseph Berkson, who, in the midst of the 20th century, asked the question, were cigarettes really causing cancer? The two of them both argued that the statistics that were provided by different media sources were in fact not showing causation, but correlation between cigarettes and specific lung cancers. Jerome Cornfield countered these claims alongside various leading cancer institutes of NCI and ACS, among others, in which he argued that there were overwhelming evidence in favor of the causative factor of smoking. As debates continued, a much broader question was brought to light. Is there such thing as cause and effect? Bertrand Russell delved into this topic within his book Principia Mathematica, in which he argued about symbolic logic. This idea was an opposing viewpoint to Aristotelian logic from prior centuries that took into account mathematic principles specifically of calculus and statistics and assigned truth values to different thought atoms called propositions. For any combination of these propositions, truth values could be assigned A and A or B, A and B, neither A nor B. However, there was one that could not be assigned, and that was A causes B. From these lines of reasoning, it seemed that cause and effect could not be reconciled through symbolic logic. This led to a brand new thought process called material implications. The idea of this was that A implies B. This was postulated by Robert Koch, in which he created three criteria for this implication. Number one, wherever B could exist, A existed. Number two, wherever A did not exist, B could not exist. And number three, when B was removed, A would no longer exist. Koch applied this to a test of a certain ineffective agent on a specific disease, and his thought process was later brought to the cancer controversy. If the properties of epidermoid carcinoma of the lung and cigarettes were put to these propositions A and B, not only could the claims not be reasonably met within this line of reasoning, but they all seemed to be false. There were two trains of thoughts that tried to solve the issues of material application, one of which was from Cornfield again, and he proposed prospective studies and epidemiological studies. Prospective studies were retroactive random studies that took patients who had already had the disease and surveyed them for smoking. These were criticized, however, because of high possibility for biased or invalid samples. The next solution that Cornfield proposed was epidemiological studies. These studies were based off of surveys from family members of deceased victims of lung carcinomas. Unfortunately, the solution was also criticized because of unreliability of family members to answer. accurately. Cornfield responded to both of these critiques, specifically about the bias of opportunity samples, and stated that if cause and effect relationships held as a result of fundamental biology, then the patient's different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds were not relevant. Publication bias was also a very big issue in the cause and effect relationship research, in which Fisher personally took great importance in. He argued that with most of the smoking research that had been presented to the public at that point in time, a lot of the work was censored from different non smoking institutes, and additionally, there were many hidden inconsistencies throughout the research that were not provided in the published studies. Fisher's solution to this problem demanded that treatments be randomly assigned to subjects, but evidently, this did not add much to the debate because it was typically being done previously. Fisher and Cornfield never made up a solution to the issue of correlation versus causation between smoking and lung cancers. While today we can generally agree that smoking is a leading cause of carcinogenic lung cancer, the greater issue that Fisher and Cornfield could demonstrate still persists. Cause and effect relationships are not simply defined or proved. And that concludes chapter 18.
During the summer of 1913, George W. Snechter left the University of Kentucky to teach mathematics at the University of Iowa. He knew nothing about Iowa's geography, so he ended up in Ames, Iowa, the home of Iowa State College, instead of Iowa City, where the University of Iowa was. This is when he found out Iowa State College wasn't looking for a mathematician. However, they were accepting a lot of students who struggled in math, so he ended up getting a job teaching algebra. 6 years later, Snechter convinced the faculty to prepare a course including the new ideas of statistical methods after R.A. Fisher's first papers on agricultural experiments began to appear. Throughout his education, Snechter hadn't taken any courses in probability theory, so he decided to stay in Ames to study these new developments that had appeared, and also because he was interested in founding a statistical laboratory. Snechter ended up creating the first department of statistics in the United States. He studied Fisher's work and then went on to review the work of Pearson, Edgeworth, Yates, and many other mathematicians. Although Snechter didn't contribute a lot in original research, he was a synthesizer who created many ideas. Snechter produced a textbook called Statistical Methods in the 1930s, which was published in 1940 and became the preeminent text in the field of stats. Snechter also improved Fisher's text, Statistical Methods for Research Workers, by adding mathematical derivations, pulling similar ideas close, and including extensive sets of tables that made it possible to calculate p-values and confidence intervals with a minimum amount of effort. In the 1970s, a review of citations and published scientific articles from all areas of science revealed that Snechter's text was the most frequently cited book. The Statistical Laboratory and the Department of Science Statistics at Ames, Iowa, became one of the most important centers of statistical research in the world. Gertrude Cox, who had dreams of becoming a missionary in far-off lands, came to study at Iowa State during this time, before World War II. She had dedicated her life after high school for 7 years to social service in the Methodist Church, where she needed a university education to apply to the missionary service that she was interested in. Snechter ended up convincing her that statistics was even more interesting, and she stayed after graduating to work with him at the laboratory. In 1931, Gertrude received the first master's degree in statistics granted by Iowa State, and she was hired by Snechter to teach in his department. Gertrude was particularly intrigued by Fisher's theories of experimental design, and she taught the first courses on it at Ames. After continuing her studies at the University of California for 2 more years, Gertrude returned to Ames with her doctorate, and Snechter then put her in charge of his statistical laboratory. The flow of prominent statisticians continued to flow through Ames, Iowa in the meantime. One of the statisticians, William Cochran, stopped by for a while and joined Gertrude in teaching experimental design,
and eventually they wrote a textbook together called Experimental Designs on the subject in 1950. Similar to Snechter's text, Statistical Methods, Experimental Design takes readers through methods with a firm foundation of mathematics behind them. It also includes a set of tables that are very useful in allowing the experimenter to modify design for a specific situation and to analyze results. The Science Citation Index publishes lists of citations from scientific journals each year, and it is printed with the citations ranged in 5 columns. Their book usually takes up at least one full column every year. So far in this book, you probably noticed that with the exception of Florence Nightingale David, that all the statisticians mentioned so far have been men. The early development of statistics was dominated by men, although many women worked in the field. Almost all women were working and doing the detailed calculations needed for statistical analysis and were often called the computers. Since statistical analysis required extensive computations, the women hand-cranked calculators, and this tedious work was usually always delegated to women because they tended to be more docile and patient, as well as they were more reliable to recheck the accuracy of their calculations than men were. As the 20th century progressed, the situation began to change by the 1990s. About half of the attendees at national meetings of statistical societies were women. Women are now prominent in the American Statistical Association, the Biometric Society, the Royal Statistical Society, and the Institute of Mathematical Statistics. However, they are still not yet equally represented with men. In the last years of the 20th century, women proved that they are just as capable of mathematical activity as men are. The scenario from the chapter that I want to highlight is when George Snechter happened to meet Frank Graham, the president of the University of North Carolina, on a train. After they discussed some of Graham's ideas, a few weeks later, Snechter was contacted by Graham. Graham was ready to set up a statistical laboratory and eventually also a statistics department similar to the one at Ames. Graham wanted Snechter's recommendation of a man to lead the department. Snechter created a list of 10 men who he felt would be most qualified. When he asked Cox of her opinion, she asked him, quote, "What about me?" Snechter ended up adding a line to his letter to Graham saying, "These are the 10 best men I can think of, but if you want the best person, I would recommend Gertrude Cox." Gertrude Cox was not only an excellent experimental scientist and an amazing teacher, but she was also a remarkable administrator who built a faculty of renowned statisticians who were also great teachers. She taught students who took on major positions in the statistical industry, academia, and government. All of her students treated her with the utmost respect and affection. In the years since she passed from leukemia, her former students gather each summer at the traditional joint meeting of the statistical societies and hold a sponsored road race in her honor, where they raise money for scholarships in her name. By 1946, Cox's Department of Applied Statistics became so successful that Frank Graham was able to establish a new Department of Mathematical Statistics at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, followed by a Department of Biostatistics soon afterwards. The role that Gertrude Cox undertook developed from the creation of her teacher, George Snechter. Women played an important role in the statistical components of government in America, serving in many senior positions. One of the most senior was Jeanette Norwood, who retired as Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1991. In 1949, she received a PhD from Tufts University and became the youngest person at that time to have done so. She was the first woman to be named Commissioner of Labor Statistics position that she held from 1979 to 1991. Norwood joined Labor Statistics in 1963, and by 1970 she was in charge of the Consumer Price Index, also known as the CPI. The CPI is used to index Social Security payments, track inflation, and adjust most transfers of payment from the federal to the state governments. The CPI and other measures of the nation's economic health are always being subjected to re-examination and Norwood oversaw the last major overhaul of the CPI. She also had to reconcile the difference in opinions about similarly arbitrary definitions in overseeing a major overhaul of the CPI, although there will always be sincere critics who object to them. Gertrude Crooks and Jeanette Norwood are the two women described in this chapter who are primarily administrators and teachers. However, women also played important roles in the development of theoretical statistics. Grace Waba at the University of Wisconsin took a set of ad hoc ethics of curvetting called spline fits and found a theoretical formula that now dominates the statistical analysis of splines. Nancy Mann at North American Rockwell discovered a link between the Weibull and a much simpler distribution and developed the method that is now used in that field. Yvonne Bishop was a member of a committee of statisticians and medical statistics in the late 1960s who were trying to determine if the widely used anesthetic halothane was the cause of an increase in liver failure. For 10 years, attempts that had been made to organize complicated, multidimensional table accounts like those in the study, but none were successful. Bishop took it up and examined the fear of radical ramifications, establishing criteria for estimation and interpretation, and she was able to publish a definitive text on it. Her method became known as log linear models, and they are now the first standard step in most sociological studies. As we reflect back on the days of Snechter and Cox, couldn't we say, quote unquote, the best person in statistics has mostly been women?
Just a Plain Texas Farm Boy is the story of Samuel L. Wilkes and his contribution to statistics. Samuel L. Wilkes left his Texas family farm to the University of Iowa in the 1920s to continue his mathematical studies. The discovery of the world's truth started unfolding through mathematical abstractions. Pure abstraction fields became popularized around the world, but American universities were said to be the best of the best at abstracting and were recognized among the top echelon of mathematical journals. Wilkes had the honor of being taught by R.I. Moore, the most renowned member of the university's mathematics department, as his first graduate mathematical course at the University of Iowa. Moore's topology course, which is the study of stretching, twisting, and changes in the geometry of objects, sometimes referred as rubber sheet geometry, introduced Wilkes to the world of impractical abstractions. Everett F. Lindquist, Wilkes' thesis advisor, who worked in mathematics and insurance, proposed a problem from his era to Wilkes as Wilkes looked for a PhD thesis topic in Iowa University. He suggested a mathematical problem involving the method of measurement used in educational psychology. The results were published in the Journal of Educational Psychology but did not spark any interest in anyone since both psychology and statistics were considered frivolous. Wilkes then went to Columbia for a year of postgraduate study to expand his knowledge of handling abstractions of mathematics, and in the fall of 1993 he became a math instructor at Princeton University. In the United States, Princeton's mathematics department was known for the wonderful findings of mathematical abstractions. The Institute of Advanced Studies was established near the university and was filled with world-renowned mathematicians. Everyone in the institute was interested in all math fields. Lord Eisenhart, the chairman of the mathematics department at Princeton, was interested in Wilkes' approach to mathematical statistics and applied mathematics. Not only did Wilkes' approach to mathematics set him apart from the department, but his personality. He was organized, hardworking, and quick at finding solutions to problems that people struggled with. He could settle arguments with his Texas farm boy attitude, encouraged people to work hard, and was great at pursuing people when it comes to his mathematical vision. He successfully persuaded a new faculty member, John Tukey, to join his statistical research. Soon after arriving at Princeton, he was appointed editor of the Annals of Mathematical Statistics, raising the standards of its publications and encouraging his graduate students to edit the journal. Wilkes soon worked with the Educational Testing Service, helping them formulate the samples sampling procedures and scoring techniques for college entrance and other professional schools thanks to his thesis on educational psychology. His theoretical work also proved that weighted scoring schemes could differ and still produce similar results. Wilkes' most important work was when he consulted with the Office of Naval Research in Washington during the 1940s, believing that experimental design methods could improve weapons and fire doctrines of armed forces. When the U.S. entered the World War II, they were ready to apply statistical methods in operation research. He set up the Statistical Research Group Princeton under the National Defense Research Council and filled it with young mathematicians and statisticians. An example of their work is to find a method of destroying non-metallic landmines that were placed in random patterns on Japan's beaches. A graduate student from the SRGP, Richard Anderson, and others had to design experiments using lines of explosive core to destroy the mines. According to Anderson, it was impossible to calculate ways to destroy the landmines, causing the U.S. to drop the atomic bomb since the drop of bombs failed to destroy Europe's landmines. Wells also helped organize a second group, Statistical Research Group Princeton Jr., at Columbia University. SRGP Jr. helped develop sequential analysis, which is a way that allows the modification of designs during the experiment. The mathematics of sequential analysis allows scientists to do modifications that can and cannot be done without affecting the validity of conclusions. Sequential analysis was top secret during the war, but when it was over, sequential methods of statistical analysis were widely used in industrial control, quality control, medical research, and sociology. Wilkes continued to work with the armed forces, helping them improve quality control of their equipment using statistics in all aspects of military doctrine. Statistics, once known as a messy practical branch of mathematics, had been clarified and honed into mathematics and is used to prove whether the events are true or not. Concepts of probability spaces and stochastic processes become more unified and abstract. Wilkes helped American and European universities realize that statistics is important, making them develop separate statistics departments such as the Department of Biostatistics, Department of Epidemiology, and Department of Applied Statistics. Samuel S. Wilkes died at 58 in 1964 and played a major role in the development of statistics. The American Statistical Association honors his memory by presenting the S. Wilkes Medal to someone who meets his standard of creativity and engagement in the real world. Thank you for listening.
In the beginning of the 20th century, a mass migration began from Europe to England, the United States, Australia, and South Africa. Many of such immigrants were of the lowest income earners and settled into the poorest areas of such countries. In order to escape poverty, immigrant families encouraged their children to achieve academically. The Polish immigrant Moses Gooddak arrived in London and established himself as a watchmaker. He had a son, first named Isidore Good, and then referred to as Jack later in life. At the age of 9, Jack Good became proficient in mental arithmetic and pondered the concept of the square root of 2 as he was bedridden with diphtheria. By the age of 10, he discovered the irrationality of the square root of 2 and found a solution to the Diophantine problem, or, quote, Pell's equation. That had been discovered in ancient Greece and was solved in the 16th century. Having made remarkable discoveries by a young age, Good was enrolled in Haberdasher's Aske's school in Hampstead, in which he graduated as one of the very few boys who excelled in the harsh and demanding curriculum. Good continued to ponder mathematical problems and discovered the principle of mathematical induction. Being known as a child prodigy, he entered Cambridge University by the age of 19, where he continued to excel against mountingly difficult teachers and curriculum, until he graduated with a PhD in mathematics in 1941. His PhD thesis covered the topic of topological concepts of partial dimension. As the Second World War raged on, Good became a cryptoanalyst in Bletchley Park, where he toiled at breaking German secret codes. He did so by converting the letters of messages into sequences or numbers. Using their knowledge of statistical frequency, cryptanalysts were able to decode complex messages within hours. However, their methods of noting repeating numbers as meaning the same character began to fail them as the Germans began to change the code with each letter. Cryptanalysts began to look towards the statistical patterns to estimate the irregularities of code, and continue to decode these messages that way. Good and other cryptanalysts used the hierarchy of Bayes' model to continue to break increasingly complex codes, and Good was celebrated for his development in the empirical Bayes model. After his time serving the war effort, Good became deeply interested in the theories of mathematical statistics. He returned to British intelligence, where he assisted in adopting computers to aid cryptanalysts. The British utilized the infinite number combinations made possible by computers to investigate classification theories. Good then went on to complete his SCD from Cambridge and his DSc from Oxford, and became a University Distinguished Professor at Virginia Polytech Institute, where he remained until he retired in 1944. Jack Good's most notable mathematical philosophy was his belief in coincidences and recurring numbers, which he references how he arrived in Virginia on the 7th hour of the 7th day of the 7th month of the year 7 in the 7th decade, and was put in apartment 7 on block 7. He believes recurring numbers to be God's method of proving his existence to non-believers, which fuels his search for the philosophical meaning behind the models used in statistics. While Jack Good led a life marked by early academic achievement and many honorable degrees in prestigious universities, another genius statistician by the name of Percy Diasonis mirrored his success despite having a very different journey. Percy Diasonis was born to Greek immigrants who settled in New York in 1945. Percy was intrigued by the mathematical puzzles from a young age, and was enthralled by the teachings of Martin Gardner's Scientific American, where he wrote of card sharps and methods used to create the illusion of a difference, i.e. magic tricks. This practice interested Diasonis due to its involvement with the intricate problems in probability. Having done magic since he was 5 years old, Diasonis ran away from home when he was 14. He met Dia Verman, who was a traveling magician. Verman invited Diasonis to join his show as an assistant, and thus he chose to run away with him and follow his love for magic and tricks. He learned much from Verman, and eventually took the helm of the traveling magic show when Verman eventually retired. To appeal to an American population, Diasonis adopted the stage name Percy Warren, and lived a life roaming with each paying gig. After show business began to weigh on Warren, he decided to return to his academic life, which he abandoned when he was only 14. Despite not earning a high school diploma, he enrolled in the City College of New York, and then those close to him pulled strings to accelerate his graduation, unbeknownst to Warren himself. However, Warren had an unconventional reason for wanting to attend college. He wanted to learn formal mathematics to understand William Feller's book, Introduction to Probability Theory and its Applications, Volume 1. Once he graduated CCNY in 1971, at the age of only 26, he conceded to applying to Harvard's statistics department, despite originally aiming for the mathematical graduate studies. Unexpectedly, Warren remained interested in statistics and obtained his PhD in mathematical statistics in 1974, which eventually carried him to the position as professor at Harvard University. As mentioned in Jack Good's stories, the emergence of the electronic computer completely reshaped statistical analysis, allowing for faster and extremely lengthy analyses, assisting with difficulties such as the 24 by 24 matrix. While the computer had mostly been used for complicated analyses of variances that involved treatments and cross-indexing, Warren and other statisticians looked for more ways to utilize the computer for mathematical statistics. One way of utilizing computers was the projection pursuit, which involves the assembling of data sets in huge dimensions. For example, let's say a group of patients who are diagnosed at risk for heart disease are observed every 6 months, in which blood is drawn and searched for heart disease-related enzymes. The data accumulated from such symptoms and signs from about 20,000 patients in this study results in about 20,000 data points in a 5,000 dimensional space. In the 1950s, the theorems dubbed the curse of dimensionality suggested that as the dimension increases, it becomes difficult to get an accurate estimate of its parameters. However, the group of statisticians and Warren that I mentioned earlier realized that such data does not scatter nonsensically in a 5-dimensional state or 5,000 dimensional space, but it clusters into lower dimensions which lie on a single plane. This observation led the Stanford group to develop computer-intensive techniques for revealing such lower dimensions, used as a technique of projection pursuit, as I mentioned previously. The field of informational science had begun to emerge in higher education, with informational scientists having engineering traits and practicing mathematical statistics, which caused the development of computer science to progress hand in hand with statistics, a topic that will be discussed in Chapter 22.
I will be doing my presentation on Chapter 22, the Picasso of Statistics. Chapter 22 of The Lady Tasting Tea opens up with the author sharing his experience meeting Princeton's chairman of Department of Statistics, John Tukey, while writing his doctoral thesis in 1966. John Tukey, born in 1915 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, went through many years of schooling at esteemed universities Brown for chemistry and Princeton for mathematics. He found interest in abstract mathematics concepts and began his work in topology. Point-set topology gives a theoretical foundation to mathematical ideas, and even beneath the foundation of topology is metamathematics, which deals with questions of what it means to solve a mathematical problem and what are the unstated assumptions behind the use of logic. That's a quote from 231. Tukey would make an impact on these abstract ideas with his contributions of Tukey's lemma, or the Teichmüller-Tukey lemma, after Oswald Teichmüller and John Tukey, which, according to the Wikipedia, is a lemma that states that every non-empty collection of finite characters has a maximal element with respect to inclusion. In 1945, John Tukey became involved in practical problems while at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey, pictured here. In a recorded conversation in 1987, Tukey said, "We had an engineer named Budendum who had been building new, especially good tracking radar for tracking aerial targets. He wanted to go to California to give a paper, and he wanted a picture to show what his tracking errors were like." And John Tukey helped and gave an approximate answer to Budendum's dilemma, and although Budendum was content with the approximate answer, Tukey continued to look for more accurate solution. His work resulted in the discovery of the fast Fourier transform. So John Tukey was seen as a Picasso of statistics because of his revolutionary discoveries and changes in the field, which were unique to the field at the time. Here I have a comparison of Picasso's revolutionary artwork. This piece is called Woman in an Armchair, and Tukey's revolutionary discoveries. This is a simplified diagram of the waves that are used for FFTs, which I will delve into on this next slide. One of the most famous achievements was Tukey's involvement with Andrei Kolmogorov, a mathematician pictured right here, who focused on contributing to the mathematics of probability, topology, logic, and more. And his involvement with Kolmogorov was with the ideas on stochastic processes. When in the 1950s, Tukey invented the fast Fourier transform, or FFT, which was a technique for analyzing long strings of data via a computer. The FFT used a smoothing technique where strength would be borrowed from nearby frequencies, so good estimates could be attained without vast amounts of data. This algorithm helped the efficiency of computers during the 50s and 60s, but the FFT is still used in present day because of its great accuracy compared to other algorithms. So we all know, like, computers and their capacities are still continuously being increased. And I just thought I'd put in a little comparison between the computers from the 50s and 60s. I'm not exactly sure which year this picture is from, versus the computers we have today. And of course the looks are completely different, but the technology within is probably the most extreme difference. Moving on. A particular aspect of the computer that threatens to overwhelm statistical theory is the storing and analysis of vast amounts of data. In the 60s and 70s, at Bell Telephone Laboratories again, this idea was played around with when, quote, monitoring telephone lines for random errors and problems led to millions and millions of data items in a single computer file. That's a quote from page 233. And this picture here is what I imagine data overload looks like in a computer. It may not be accurate to how the process actually looks, but it's interesting to see it as a figure filled with data, like shown here. So this complicated aspect of computer technology, the dilemma, makes it difficult to dissect and understand all of the data within small spaces like a computer file. But thankfully, with the techniques of pioneering statistician Carl Pearson, pictured right here, parameters of probability distributions can be estimated. This leads statistics into an area of assumption. Since finding an exact population parameter is often impossible, inferences must be made to get a decent answer. And then I just wanted to put in a quote. American mathematician Eric Temple Bell stated, "Numbers do not lie, but they have the propensity to tell the truth with intent to deceive. And us humans will see patterns in places where only randomness is prominent," which can be a blessing and a curse. And so that picturing of patterns is an example of Bode's law, which is an empirical observation that explains a, quote, linear relationship between the logarithm of the distance from the sun and the number of planets in our solar system, on page 234. And here's a picture that shows Bode's law with the planets. So these observations ultimately beg the question, can we truly examine data with a tendency to look for patterns and expect to find true evidence? John Tukey reimagined Carl Pearson's approach to data after realizing that, quote, the distribution of observed data can be examined as a distribution without imposing some arbitrary probability model on it. 234. He explained through a series of papers, talks, and books that dealt with exploratory data analysis. Here is a cover of Tukey's book on exploratory data analysis from 1977, and here's a diagram simply explaining the concept of exploratory data analysis. So in the end, Tukey made his own style of observations that strayed away from the characteristics of data used in the past. He focused on how extreme values can influence our observations of patterns and adjusted for false impressions by developing graphical tools for displaying data. He showed that histograms could often be misleading and proposed to plot the square root of the frequency on a rootgram rather than plotting the frequency tables on a histogram. Many of his tools, like the stem and leaf plots and box plots, are frequently used today in statistics. Something interesting I read was he even found the standard tally mark to be foolish, so he invented his own tally mark, which consisted of 10 dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, and lines, 4 lines, and then 2 through the middle, as pictured here. Ultimately, Tukey made a huge imprint in the field of statistics with his observations, theories, and tools. He continuously made an impact with these original ideas, which is why he can be considered the Picasso of statistics. Thank you.
Chapter 23 begins by discussing the critical concept of robustness in statistics. It emphasizes that statistical methods often assume that all measurements in scientific experiments are equally valid. However, in practice, some data points may be outliers or contaminated by errors, which can significantly impact statistical analysis. Historically, scientists such as Johannes Kepler, the man who discovered that the planets orbit the sun in ellipses, sometimes discarded data that they considered incorrect. But modern statistical principles require treating all measurements as equally valid. This chapter explores George Box's background and his remarkable journey into the field of statistics. Despite initially having no formal education in statistics, Box became fascinated with the subject during his work on experiments related to poison gases during World War II. This fascination led him further to study statistics. He mentioned reading books by the author R.A. Fisher. Although he didn't understand the book, he understood what he was trying to accomplish. Box's involvement in statistical work during the war marked the beginning of his transformation into a statistician. After the war, he decided to get a formal education in statistics at University College of the University of London, which led him to become a leading figure in the field. The narrative dives into the Princeton Robustness Study, a pivotal project conducted in the late 1960s. This study, conducted by John Turkey and a group of his fellow faculty members and students, aimed to address the challenge of dealing with measurements that may be contaminated by outliers or errors. Researchers conducted extensive computer simulations to model various contaminated data distributions. The study sought to develop methods for estimating central tendencies in data, even when it includes outliers. The concepts and findings of the Princeton Robustness Study continue to be integral to the field of statistics. Robust statistical methods and the understanding of contaminated data distributions are essential for modern-day data analysis, ensuring the reliability of results even when dealing with challenging datasets. Outliers are data points that deviate significantly from the typical values in the dataset. Outliers can skew a dataset, affect variability, and influence hypothesis testing. This chapter illustrates the problem of outliers by providing a real-world example involving the estimation of income among Yale University alumni. In this example, it is highlighted how outliers can disproportionately influence the average, potentially leading to misleading conclusions. This underscores the importance of developing statistical techniques that are robust in the presence of outliers. Robust methods are designed to provide accurate results even in the presence of outliers, making them essential in modern-day analysis. This chapter also introduces the collaboration between George Box and David Cox, two prominent statisticians. They are humorously linked due to their similar last names and the English theater reference to Box and Cox, where one actor plays two minor roles. Although their statistical interests differed, they aimed to write a joint paper. They had succeeded in this task, and it was published in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society. This paper introduced the concept of Box-Cox transformations, a statistical technique that involves transforming data to improve the robustness of statistical procedures. An example of what it was used for can be that it was used in the analysis of toxicological studies of the mutational effects of chemicals on living cells, and it was also used on econometric analysis, and even in agricultural research, and that is where R.A. Fisher's methods had been originated. It has since become a valuable tool in data analysis. The statistical technique has since become an indispensable tool in data analysis applied across various domains. So all in all, Chapter 23 concludes by reinforcing the importance of robust statistical methods in handling data that may contain outliers or contamination. It highlights George Box's significant contribution to statistics, his personal journey into the field, and his collaboration with David Cox. The chapter underscores the need for statistical approaches that can effectively accommodate anomalies in data, making robustness a crucial aspect of modern statistical analysis.
In 1980, the NBC television network aired a documentary entitled If Japan Can, Why Can't We? This was when the American automobile companies were being rocked by challenges from Japan. The Japanese automobiles were vastly superior to the American cars of the 1970s in terms of their quality, and their prices were also lower. In other areas of industry apart from automobiles, from steel to electronics, the Japanese also suppressed American enterprise in both quality and cost. The NBC documentary explains how this happened, but it was really just a description of the influence one man had on Japanese industry, and his name was W. Edwards Deming, an 80-year-old American statistician. Deming, who had been working as a consultant to industry, leaving the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1939, was suddenly in great demand. During his long career as a consultant to industry, Deming had been invited many times to help the American automobile companies with quality control. He developed strong ideas about how to improve industrial methods, but senior management in these companies had no interest in the technical details of quality control. In 1947, General Douglas MacArthur was named the Supreme Allied Commander over conquered Japan. He forced Japan to adopt a democratic constitution, and he called in experts to educate the country on the American way of doing things. His staff also located W. Edwards Deming as an expert on statistical sampling methods, and Deming was invited to go to Japan to show the Japanese how we do it in America. Ichiro Ashikawa, the president of the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers, was impressed by Deming, and he invited him back to teach statistical methods in a group of seminars organized by a broad range of Japanese industry. Ashikawa also had the ear of senior management in many Japanese companies, and at his invitation, members of management also attended Deming's lectures. At the time, the phrase "made in Japan" meant poor, cheap quality imitations of other countries' products. Listeners were shocked when Deming told them that they could change that around within 5 years. He said that with the proper use of statistical methods of quality control, they could produce products of such high quality and low price that they would dominate markets all over the world. The Japanese ended up beating his prediction by almost 2 years. The Japanese were so impressed by Deming that they instituted an annual Deming Prize to encourage the development of effective new methods of quality control in Japanese industry. The Japanese government was excited by the prospects of using statistical methods for improvement of all activities. The Education Ministry even instituted a National Statistics Day where students competed for prizes by creating presentations in statistics. Statistical methods swept over Japan, and almost all of it derived from Deming's seminars. After the NBC documentary was released, Deming was welcomed by American industry. He set up a series of seminars to present his ideas to the American management, but senior management of most American companies did not understand what they had done, and they sent their technical experts who already knew about quality control to the seminars. Deming's message was directed to the management primarily, and it was a nasty, critical message about how management, especially senior management, had been failing to do their jobs. To illustrate his message, Deming had the students of his seminar engaged in a manufacturing experiment. His point was that management often set impossible standards and made no attempt to determine if the standards can even be met or not. He claimed that instead, American senior management relied on experts and quality control to keep the standards, ignoring the frustrations factory workers might have. Deming was particularly critical in the fads of management that would sweep the American industry. In the 70s, the fad was called a zero defect, which meant that there would be no defects in their product, and that was a condition that Deming knew was completely impossible. In the 80s, the fad was called Total Quality Management, or TQM, and Deming viewed all of this as nothing more than just empty words from management, who he thought should be doing their real jobs instead. Deming's major point about quality control is that the output of a production line is variable. It has to be a variable because that is the nature of all human activity. He says that what a customer wants is not a perfect product, but a reliable product. The customer wants a product with low variability so that they can know what to expect from it. R.A. Fisher's analysis of variance allows the analysis to separate the variability of a product into two sources. One source Deming called special causes, and the other he called common or environmental causes. Deming insisted that the special causes are few and can be easily identified, and the environmental causes are always there. He said the causes are the result of poor management, since they are often in the form of poorly maintained machines or variable quality in the stock used for manufacturing or other uncontrolled working conditions. Deming proposed that the production line be seen as a stream of activities that start with raw material and end with the finished product. He says quality control becomes a continuous process where the most variable aspect of the production line is constantly being worked on. The finishing results of Deming's approach was Japanese cars that ran for 100,000 miles or more without major repairs, ships that needed minimum maintenance, steel that was consistent quality from batch to batch, and other results of an industry where the variability of quality was under control. Deming insisted that management have the responsibility of monitoring the parameters of these measurement distributions and changing fundamental aspects of the manufacturing process in order to improve those parameters. Salzburg first met Deming at a statistical meeting in the 1970s. He says Deming was a formidable figure among statisticians, and he rarely saw him rise up during the questions after a talk to criticize, but instead he would often take someone aside after the session to criticize that person for failing to see what he thought was obvious. He saw his public persona, and he was known for his kindness and consideration for those he worked with, his very subtle sense of humor, and his interest in music. Deming sang in a choir, played drums and flute, and published several original pieces of sacred music. He was born in Sioux City, Iowa in 1900, and he attended the University of Wyoming, where he studied mathematics with a strong interest in engineering. He received a master's degree in mathematics and physics from the University of Colorado, and he met his wife Agnes Bell at the university. They moved to Connecticut in 1927, where he began studying for a doctorate in physics at Yale University. Deming's first industrial job was at the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric, where he worked during the summers he was at Yale. Walter Shewhart had been laying the groundwork for statistical quality control methods at Bell Labs in New Jersey, and Western Electric was part of the same company. Attempts were being made to apply Shewhart's methods at the Hawthorne plant, but Deming realized they had failed to understand Shewhart's message. Quality control was becoming a set row of manipulations based on setting ranges of variability that were allowable. The ranges were often set so that 5% or less of the time a defective product would get through quality control. Deming later dismissed this version of quality control as a guarantee that 5% of the customers would be dissatisfied. With his degree from Yale, Deming went to the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1927, where he worked on sampling techniques and experimental designs for the next 12 years. He left government to set up his own consulting company and began running seminars on the use of quality control in the industry, which were expanded during World War II when he trained about 2,000 designers and engineers. These students went on to give seminars at their own companies until the quality control specialists trained by Deming reached almost 30,000 by the end of the war. The last Deming seminar took place on December 10, 1993 in California. 93-year-old W. Edwards Deming participated, but much of the seminar was run by his younger assistants. On December 20th, he died in his home in Washington, D.C. The Deming Institute was founded by his family and friends in November 1993 to foster understanding of the Deming system of profound knowledge to advance commerce, prosperity, and peace. To close out this chapter, Deming said, statisticians need to become interested in problems and to learn and teach statistical inference and limitations, because the better we understand the limitations of an inference from a set of results, the more useful becomes the inference.
While in the early 20th century, the field of statistics was predominantly composed of male theoreticians, the increasing degree of inclusivity allowed more women to gain a spotlight in such areas using statistics as industry and government. Some of the most notable female statisticians of that time period included Judith Goldberg and Paula Norwood, who were heads of statistics departments at large pharmaceutical companies, Mavis Carroll, who was head of Mathematical and Statistical Services Division at General Foods, and finally, Stella Conliffe, who was the first woman to attain the position of President of Royal Statistical Society in Great Britain and achieve recognition and success in both industry and government. Stella was praised by the members of her social circle for her excellent sense of humor, sharp common sense, and her ability to succinctly convey highly intricate mathematical models in simpler terms for her scientific colleagues. All of the aforementioned qualities were unveiled when Stella gave an annual presidential address for the Royal Statistical Society on the 12th of November in 1975, where she addressed the growing need for statisticians to develop more practical applications of abstract theory in collaboration with scientists and other disciplines. She wrote, quote-unquote, "It is no use, as statisticians, our being sniffy about the slapdash methods of many sociologists unless we are prepared to try to guide them into more scientifically acceptable thought. To do this, there must be interaction between us." Stella stressed that statistical and sociological ideas and sciences could only be analyzed correctly if used in relationship to each other. Stella studied statistics at the London School of Economics in the late 1930s during the Spanish Civil War, which drove many students and members of the faculty to volunteer in the fight against the Nazis, and forced numerous economists, mathematicians, and other scientists to flee Germany and take contemporary jobs in the university. Historical events happening during the time period also impacted the beginning of Stella's professional background. After eventually graduating with a degree, she took on a job at the Danish baking company that required very little use of statistics, and in which she had to partake due to the employment crisis caused by the Great Depression. As the war progressed, Conliffe contributed her skills as a statistician in food allocation programs and volunteered with concentration camp victims and dislocated persons in the Netherlands, Germany, and Britain after the war ended. Once she returned home, Stella was offered a job at the statistical department of Guinness Brewing Company, which was founded by William Seeley Gossett, who was mentioned in the previous chapters. The female employees were often looked down upon at Guinness in 1946, according to Stella. In the following excerpt, she writes about her female training supervisor at the Dublin brewery. She impressed on me what a privilege it was to have been chosen to work for Guinness. It reminded me that I was expected to wear stockings and a hat, and if I was lucky enough to meet one of the chosen race, known as brewers, in the corridor, on no account was I to recognize him, but should I lower my eyes until he had passed. Despite this condescending attitude towards female employees at Guinness, Stella gained an outstanding reputation in the company and soon began to participate in hands-on field work and conduct agricultural experiments in Ireland. She regarded the duties of an office job with contempt, so she started to administer the process of data collection herself, while collaborating with scientists from other fields. Stella believed that being passionate and flexible while working with other scientists and willing to perform hands-on work were the true duties of a statistician. She wrote that, quote-unquote, unless the experiment is accepted as vital by the statistician, so that the enthusiasm of the experimenter is shared by the statistician, I submit that his contribution to the work is less than optimum. Additionally, Stella contributed a lot to the statistical study by urging statisticians to look for larger ideas behind statistical findings. She acknowledged and pointed out the hidden biases and irrational preferences all of us possess. In one of the expensive but valuable experiments for Guinness that she was a part of, the research was directed to find out which temperature the customers preferred for their beer. The subjects were seated in multiple rooms, varying in temperature, and were served beer sealed with crown seals of various colors at diverse temperatures. As Stella writes in her address, the results of the experiment have revealed that, quote-unquote, the only thing that mattered to the subjects was the color of the crown seals, that they did not like beer with yellow crown seals. In another experiment, a team of statisticians at Guinness, including Stella, was advised to analyze the capacity of handmade beer casks and determine whether the casks were of proper volume. The casks were weighed by a woman who had to weigh on an empty cask and then fill it with water and weigh the full cask afterwards. Of the casks that were more than 3 pence below or more than 7 pence above the appropriate size were discarded and sent for modification. The photo in the top right corner of the presentation illustrates the tentative process of cask replacement that took place at Guinness. While assessing the process as a part of ongoing quality control, the statisticians found that there was an anomalously large number of casks that were barely making it, and a very low number of casks just off the limits. In order to find out the flaw behind the results, the statisticians analyzed the conditions of the woman weighing the casks, and found that she had to throw the discarded casks on a high pile and place the accepted cask on the conveyor belt. Stella suggested that her weighing position was placed on top of the bin for discarded casks, which would allow the woman to simply kick the cask into the pile. This one simple modification resolved the issue with the excess of casks just barely making it. After becoming the head of the statistical department at Guinness in 1970, she was hired by the research unit of the British Home Office, which oversees police, criminal courts, and prisons. In her address, Stella particularly complained about the lack of precise, rigid scientific analysis of statistical findings that she discovered at the Home Office. The majority of the criminological research was performed by examining retrospective data for effects of public policy. One of such analyses that Stella supervised had compared the length of sentences given to adult male prisoners and the percentage of those men who were convicted within 2 years of discharge. The findings suggested that inmates with short sentences had higher rates of recidivism, which made many believe that long sentences reduced the rate of recidivism among criminals. Conliffe was not satisfied with such a hasty conclusion and thoroughly examined the results. She concluded that the majority of prisoners with short sentences were either old, homeless, poor, or mentally ill, and were often reconvicted because they could not be admitted to proper facilities that could take care of them. On the other hand, criminals with long sentences were often convicted due to serious crimes, such as large frauds and forgeries, which the criminals were unlikely to commit again or were too old to commit more crimes upon discharge, which is why they were not reconvicted again. Lastly, throughout her life and in her address, Stella stressed the importance of practical application of statistics and condemned abstract mathematical analysis for the sake of elegance, which, as she pointed out, many of her male colleagues demanded. I will end the summary of this chapter with a quote from Stella Conliffe. She writes, quote unquote, "We statisticians are educated to calculate the mathematical precision, but we are not good at persuading the uninitiated that our findings are worth heeding. We shall not succeed in so doing if we solemnly quote p less than 0.001 to an uncomprehending man or woman. We must explain our findings in their language and develop the powers of persuasion.